I'm Rachel, and welcome to my Hanukkah 5782/2021 vlog. This is an annual tradition for me. I will link to my playlist of these videos down below of reading from a Jewish short story collection for each of the 8 nights of Hanukkah, lighting my candles, and then discussing the stories with you. I base this off of the Christmas Advent calendar tradition. I know that there is at least one company that sends out short stories for each of the days of the Advent calendar, so I thought I'd do my own little twist on it and do a Jewish version. And so this year I am reading and reviewing stories in this collection. Today, A Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket by Hilma Wolitzer. These are a collection of short stories from throughout her career, and the first one is the titular one, Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket, which she wrote in 1966. It's a story that's very slight, and it also took a little bit of time to get on its feet. I was a little confused in the beginning about who was who, what was what, but ultimately it came down to the protagonist being a first-person lady who was watching the woman go mad in the supermarket, and both of these women were mothers. The protagonist was pregnant and in fact grew tired throughout this ordeal from standing up as long as she did, and then the woman who went mad had 2 young children, clinging to her that she seemed only vaguely aware of, and her vague speechifying was seemed to be, that she was out of sorts with her life and her husband. So the story was about the protagonist and the manager of the supermarket trying to find out who this woman was. Her pocketbook was empty, and ultimately there was a gaggle of women who were trying to, get by, and the protagonist approached one of them, and they were ultimately able to figure out who this woman was, and the manager called the husband to pick her up, and one of the children had had an accident by that point, and so went the story. And then later at home, the protagonist is soaking in the bath and crying, feeling like she can't save everybody or mother everybody. That's the language that she and her husband are using. So in my mind, this is very much a commentary on the strenuousness of motherhood, maybe how much pressure we put on ourselves or other people put on us. I'm speaking of mothers, that is, because of this very traditionally domestic place for a breakdown to happen for a person defined by motherhood, a woman defined by motherhood, a woman going mad. These have a lot of sort of gendered connotations to them, so it very much seemed a rumination on that sort of thing. But it was a very slight story as well. I'm looking forward to going through the rest of this collection and seeing what the rest of Wolitzer's stories look like throughout the rest of her career. It's the second night of Hanukkah, and I'm reviewing Waiting for Daddy, published in 1971. I like this story a lot better. I think in a way it's a story more about an idea than, a specific event, although it is very much about this young woman, Sandy, waiting for her father, who disappeared when she was too young to remember, it seems. We actually begin the story when she's a little girl and end it when she seems to be some sort of teenager or young adult. And it very much deals with the fantasy she has in mind about who her father might have been, or what it feels like to wait for him, and this lack of relationship. She lives with her mother and her grandmother. Interestingly enough, there's no grandfather either, although I guess that's a little bit of a tangent. Her mother and her grandmother, they move her around a bit. She's lower class, lives in what she calls bad neighborhoods because her mother and grandmother take on odd jobs. This does seem to talk a lot about a certain time period, like where, first of all, it's easy for a man to get up and leave without guilt. Also, it might be more difficult for women to have more stable employment, so that adds to this insecurity that bolsters the fantasies that shift as Sandy grows from a young girl into a young woman. She becomes sexually active with her first boyfriend, Arnie, who she tells her father is dead. The way she says it, it's like basically to have revenge on him. Definitely seems like the sexual relationship is tied in a bit to Sandy's feelings about her father, like the way that she sort of cynically views Arnie saying I love you" as just some sort of ritualistic part of the sex. And yeah, after one of these liaisons, Sandy comes home and she tries to engage her mother directly, like, where could my father be? What do you remember about like what you did with his stuff when he left? And her mother, who also talks a lot about like, movies, and really it's just another layer of fantasy and denial, just can't talk about it. It gets her very upset, and her grandmother gets upset at Sandy as well. So it's just obvious that they also have, put a fantasy on this whole lack of relationship, and they're, have, justified it and contextualized the lack of relationship away, and aren't going to give Sandy anything concrete about her father and this thing that she might want. She might, obviously want to have more information about this man, but she's not going to get it. So the final image is like the most metaphorical, where she looks out into the night sky and kind of releases the image of him. And again, it's also kind of sexual, like the stars are like an ejaculation of a sort of releasing this, fantasy of him out into the wild. And really, that's, I think, all that she's going to get out of that relationship, or lack thereof. But I thought it worked well as a meditation on this waiting for daddy. It's night 3 of Hanukkah, and I'm reviewing Photographs, which was published in 1976. I feel like I can be a little shorter with this one, even though ironically it's a little bit of a longer story, but I certainly have been rambling a bit lately. But anyway, this is a mostly snarky and humorous take on marriage and birth that basically begins with, back in the day, you couldn't get an abortion as easily. Although then it does take a turn into, marriage that seems to be kind of happy, or like, looking forward to the birth of a kid, and, the couple visits friends with another kid, a kid of their own, and they look at pictures of that couple's birth, and like, looking on their kid, and there's like, this hopeful sort of happiness to those scenes. But then, once we get to the birth labor scenes, it's incredibly, snarky and funny because it's so stressful and, kind of awful. So, it takes a turn again. But yeah, it's an amusing and engaging story. Although, I guess speaking of my own bias, I was a little tired when reading it, and it was a bit longer, but I could tell that it was well crafted too, so definitely recommend. It is the 4th night of Hanukkah, and I am discussing the story Sundays, which was published in 1974. This is another story about the first-person protagonist and her husband Howard. I read a story about them last night, which was about their marriage and the birth of their child, which seemed rather rapid fire, the way that story was about the beginnings of both of those relationships, I guess. In this one, they have 2 children, a little boy and a baby daughter. And it is very much about Howard's depression in a way, although it starts, it's a very interior story, and it starts with Wolitzer, I think, dancing around the issues before she dives into the 2 of them in bed, starting their Sunday morning. The wife, the protagonist, kind of trying to get him out of his funk, and then they go throughout a routine that's, I think, pretty normal for their Sundays, where first of all, they have a nice breakfast with the kids, or at least a pungent breakfast with a lot of, nice description, but not too over the top. And then they go to see some model homes outside of the city, or at least one model home. And Howard's always at a little bit of a remove but it does seem like this is something that he fantasizes about, getting out of the city and into this model home. And you know, he isn't really able throughout the story to sort of articulate why he's depressed, but it's almost like it's an excuse. He gives sort of varied excuses, like, oh, we got to get out of the city where, you know, we could get raped or hurt or something, or I just want a place where I can, you know, unpack all my books. And the narrator describes him as someone who doesn't really dig into his past about why he might be depressed, and just sort of, it might be excuses, at least in her head. She kind of thinks so, but throughout the day, after, you know, going through all these emotions, he does kind of come back to, you know, himself, or a happier self at the end of the day. And it's interesting because their book ended in bed at the beginning and the end of Sunday, and we kind of get into the protagonist's anxious feelings. This is such an interior story after all. It's less about what happens and more about the feelings around it. And we do know that the narrator is a little more iffy about wanting to leave the city. Like, she kind of likes it there. She kind of sees it as a hideout, is how she describes it, which is interesting. So yeah, it's not exactly a concrete story in all facets, but I do think it, you know, captures a little bit of human nature in a way that I found engaging. Oh, and also, there was one brief mention of Yiddish, so now I can officially label this collection a Jewish collection for more than just Wallitzer being Jewish. I'll take it. It is the 5th night of Hanukkah, and I am discussing the short story Over Time, also published in 1974, and also about our protagonist and Howard. In this story, they're dealing with Howard's ex-wife Rennie, who, in an amusing twist, their son Jason calls Weenie, because they talk so much that he's on the phone with her sometimes. But anyway, the title is also very clever, because it's about the idea of being overtime on a marriage. Like, the marriage was 7 months long, and there wasn't any alimony or anything, but Rennie remains a bit of a mess, and so she's constantly calling, and I guess out of a sense of guilt or just exasperation, they pay off debts and that sort of thing. And then the specific event of this story is that Rennie met someone, like in unemployment, who then freaked her out with his intensity, and so she wanted to get away and stay with them for a few days, you know, cool off until hopefully this guy goes away. And it doesn't take very long for the protagonist to, you know, be absolutely sick of this and want this woman gone from her life. And it turns out that the guy from unemployment does track her down. And in a move that I feel like is much more 70s than modern, the protagonist is desperately trying to get Rennie to accept this guy, even though to me, as a modern day reader, I guess he had like red flags all over him, to my mind. I don't know, it's an interesting conundrum. Like, shortly before this, the protagonist was on the phone with her mother seeking advice, and her father, and that was also amusing. But anyway, there's just a throwaway line about the things that her mother finds abnormal, and one of them is homosexuality. And I'm like, well, you know, obviously this is the 70s, and it's, you know, a time of homophobia and distrust. But then we get to, you know, this really aggressive guy who tracks a woman down, obviously without her consent, and the protagonist is okay with it. But it might not even be a 70s thing. It might just be the protagonist being desperate to get rid of Rennie. And she does go, and she even marries this guy, although it then turns, you know, sour after a little while. The ending of the story was weird to me because Rennie stayed distant, but the new ex-husband became part of their lives and in fact stayed on their couch at one point. And it seemed like the protagonist had a little bit of affection for him. So maybe in my mind, this is a story of not judging people too harshly based off of their behavior. I don't know, because that guy was red flags all to me, but maybe there's more to him. I don't know. It was a weird ending, but overall, enjoyable story. It is the 6th night of Hanukkah, and I've read Trophies, published in 1975, moving up a year. This is still a what I called a Howard and protagonist story, although I remember in the first story the protagonist was named Paulie, although I don't think her name has ever shown up in any of the other stories, but I'm pretty sure we can say it's the same person. Anyway, in this story, Howard's father dies, and so he has to go to Florida for an extended period of time to help his mother, take care of things. And during Howard's absence, Paulie is lonely, and it's just like a vignette of her loneliness. Like, she attempts to make friends, or maybe she just sits with people, like in the playground with her kids. The big thing is her neighbor in 16J, and that's all she calls him, is 16J. She sees him in the laundry room, and she sees his dour wife, and she kind of, I feel like she imagines a relationship with him just out of loneliness. Is just sort of, doing that thing in her head. Meanwhile, the few times that Howard calls, she, cooks up all these, thoughts about, oh, well, my in-laws never liked me much, and it's just, this loneliness and distrust and yelling over long distance. And then ultimately, speaking of 16J, Polly finds some like hearts in the baby's crib under the mattress, and it seems like she attributes them to 16J, like that he came in somehow, because she'd been thinking, well, maybe he has a crush on me, and that she thinks he's also watching her. And anyway, I don't know, that felt really weird to me, but it did get Howard to come home. But it seems more like something Howard would have done for her, as a, I'm leaving for a while, think of me fondly. I don't know, but instead, she calls him like, oh, there's a maniac in the apartment, and you have to come back, or at least that's why he decides to come back, it seems. So that's kind of how it ends. And I guess there's an interesting thing when you can think about what the trophies are in this book. Like, is Howard coming back a trophy? Or, I don't know, the first line was sort of about Howard ascending to the new generation with his father's death. So it's almost like that's a trophy in and of itself generationally. So yeah, I guess this one didn't do as much for me, but still invested in Howard and Polly. It is the 7th night of Hanukkah, and I've read Mother in this collection. It was published in 1987. And this story is not about Harold and Polly. It's about an entirely new couple. It's about Helen and John. And this is historical fiction, a long story that begins with their courtship in 1920, which is very much described as Helen being a spinster of 28, living with her father, and how awkward it is, and having her job and all. But she meets her husband John at a party, and they do in fact hit it off, despite the dearth of available men after the Great War. Those historical notes they put in. But anyway, I mean, this is interesting, I guess, world building, but it feels very much like backstory to the actual meat of the story, which is 10 years later, which I guess makes Helen even older. In fact, even my age, is when she actually gets pregnant. And it's a very difficult pregnancy, and she ends up on bed rest, and then she gives birth prematurely by about a month. Yeah. But, back in, the 30s and in the Depression, but just the 30s in general, it was more dangerous for preemies, and the story becomes this very tense suspense short story, because Helen is very out of it, and the doctors and her husband claim that she's given birth, and that her child is safe and alive in the nursery, and that she's has to recover, and she obviously is ill from her labor. But the story goes on, and she never sees the baby, and that tension ratchets up slowly, like, what's going on here? Is there really a baby? And they're coming in to take her milk, and her husband is coming in to say, like, hey, we need to name the baby, right? But to her mind, Helen's mind, the baby's still in danger because they haven't brought the baby to her. So she doesn't name the baby. She's thinking about the baby being dead, and then ultimately she goes down to the basement, which to me seems like red flags. Like, really? That's where they claim the nursery is? And she goes to the basement, which is, of course, very spooky in its own way, and just, ratcheting up that tension of something is really not right here. And she's still, recovering herself. She's been, stitched up and so forth. and she's wandering around this really spooky basement and not finding the nursery. She's finding the morgue, and she's finding like the laboratory with the animals inside, with that, I guess, scared, trapped entrapment going on, and a freaky kitchen. I thought the tension was really good, but it's obviously a very depressing story, and like even beyond, the creeping certainty of what actually happened to the baby. She herself, is recovering and is, now walking around and putting herself in mental sort of turmoil. And so the ending certainly has deathly overtones, some nice metaphors, depressing metaphors, which might be about more than the baby even, although, nothing is said for certain. It's one of those stories, I don't know, would you call it open-ended? Or I guess you would, like it kind of hints at things rather than, spells them out. But, it's a depressing story, but I thought it was really good craft-wise. Yeah. Hello! It is the 8th and final night of Hanukkah, and I'm here to talk about the final story in this collection by Hilma Wolitzer. It's called The Great Escape, and it was published in 2020 along with this here book. It's the reason, really, I think, for the book being published. I have a link down below detailing more about the publication of this book, but Wolitzer wrote it after she and her husband contracted COVID, and she survived and he did not. And that tracks what happens with Howard and Paulie in the final story in this collection. I guess it is a little bit of a weird jump, because all of the rest of the Howard and Paulie stories, which took place in the 70s, were about them as a young couple with 2 kids, one of them small enough, a baby, that she was only ever called the baby. And in this final story, she's a woman in her 60s who has a lot of opinions and is, very much a present adult with a big past behind her. And then meanwhile, Jason, the precocious little boy in the other stories, is now somebody who is kind of sucking at life in both personally and professionally. I don't know, it's one of those things where I wonder if Wolitzer had her cake and ate it too, with too stereotypical of characters for the kids, on the 2 different spectrums. But anyway, what the story is really about is aging, because, we left Paulie and Howard as relatively young, even though they were dealing with such things as death in the family, but now they are very old and are dealing with, the tribulations of getting older before COVID even becomes a thing. But then, of course, that's the crux of the story, is that COVID slowly seeps into the environment, and, their daughter Anne is constantly calling and trying to micromanage to make sure that they're safe, but, in a realistic turn, I think, they didn't necessarily take it as seriously, or it's difficult to change habits. They did what they could. There was a hilarious, book club meeting on Zoom sort of thing, but Howard remained a hypochondriac and went to his podiatrist, when he had pains and that sort of thing, and that's how he got sick. And then Paulie got sick, and the story went from there. And, it turned into a story that was about, being old and near death, to actually experiencing it, and the weirdness, really, of Howard being separated from her throughout his entire sickness, so that when he died and, his ashes were, taken care of, it's like she had no tangible, confirmation of any of it. She just was in the apartment with all of his stuff, like, just like he went away for the day or something like that. There were also more references to Judaism, not many, just a couple, but that's more than we got in any of the other stories. I don't know if that means something about, being more open about Judaism in 2020, or maybe as you get older, really, especially with one of the Jewish callbacks being about how Ashkenazi families name their children after the deceased. So, when you're facing death, you're thinking about that when your great-grandchildren are being born. So, yeah, I mean, I found it to be a really touching story, a moving tribute. I'm glad that it became commentary on our day and age, and maybe that made it more tenable to me, but it is what it is, and I guess I am somebody who is ready to hear COVID stories, so long as they're well done. And that about covers it for me now. As I mentioned, I'll have a link down below to the news story about the publication of this book, how it came about, and also a link to my Goodreads review of the book. I'll be back on this channel very soon for my first Friday reads of December. Makes me very excited to get back to Friday reads. I suppose this probably rambling video was a bit of a teaser for that, getting back into the swing of reviewing stories, as it were, so check it out at the end of the week. And I hope that everyone else celebrating Hanukkah had as good of a time of it as I did, standing next to a lit menorah and talking about short stories. A belated Chag Sameach to you all, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.